Hey, I've got a confession. It's been about 2 years since the step here on our RV has actually worked properly. In fact, it was flaking out a couple of years ago, and instead of actually fixing it at the time, I disconnected it, and we just haven't been using it for the last couple years, and I haven't fixed it either. Well, you guys got a bigger step.
Yeah, I know.
There you go. Sorry, broken step. In fact, we've been using this chunk of wood as our step when we've needed a step. And I have to admit, though, that this chunk of wood has been pretty darn reliable because it's not going to fail. It's going to last forever. But today's the day where I want to actually get this fixed permanently. And I wanted to share this with you guys because there's no need to really go out and buy, you know, a whole new step assembly here because they're super expensive. And I know that there's several parts in here that actually can be replaced once you figure out what's actually wrong with the step. And I think I know what's wrong with mine, so let's go ahead and get to it and get this thing done. Okay, when I first realized that there was an issue with the step, I was taking the RV out. It was the day before we were heading out on a trip, and I was heading out to go refill my propane and pulling out of our road, and I heard this loud crunch, crash sound. I'm like, oh my God, what was that? And I was able to pull off when I got to the top of our road and realized that the step was still out, and it had scraped against this embankment and it was all bent out of shape. And I'm like, oh my God, you know, one more thing that I got to worry about the night before we're getting ready to leave. But I was able to actually, you know, with a lot of brute force, eventually get it kind of bent back into shape. The step wasn't really broken, you know, but it was still a little bit bent. It wasn't at 100%. But it seemed to be good enough to head out on this trip. The first day out, you know, we're getting ready to leave this Cabela's parking lot.
All right, Tito, what's going on? What happened?
Our step won't go back in.
Not a great start to the trip.
No, a little bit of troubleshooting here in the Cabela's parking lot. And it's starting to rain. I ended up just putting everything back together, but disconnecting all the wires, and I put a baggie around it and taped it all up, and so everything is disconnected, and that's pretty much how it's sat for the next 2 years. If you were to go out and get a new step assembly altogether, they're really expensive. They're like 400 to 600 bucks. But if you take a closer look at this, you realize that there's only a few components that you know, that actually could fail, and all of them are replaceable. Okay, so there's 3 main components to this step that we want to pay attention to, and the main one here is the control unit. So this is basically the little brain of the step, and the other 2 are the motor. So this is the main motor that drives this gear assembly. So we got the motor, we got the gear assembly, and we got the control unit. Now the control unit is powered through this cable here, this main cable that comes from the RV, and there are 4 connectors in here. There's 4 wires that come out of here that go to the main controller. Now the main red wire is the 12 volt power wire, so that's always got a 12 volt signal on there, and the other 3 are the switches. So we have our main door, that magnetic switch on the door that when it's activated will have 12 volts on there, and the other one is, I believe, the override switch, and the third one is an ignition override switch. So when the ignition is on, you should get 12 volts on that wire too, and I believe that's the brown one. When it's powered, it's just a positive and negative, this yellow and red one here, that go to the motor, and that powers the motor when it's activated to turn on, and then it'll drive this gear assembly, which will actually move this bar here with this little arm and cause the step to go in and out. Now when it's on to this black wire coming out of the controller. Actually goes to power the light, and the green wire here is just a ground. It's grounded here to the chassis, and this purple wire here is, I think, is just a switch for the light, and it's not currently used on my step here, and it was just never hooked up, I guess. Troubleshooting this step and trying to figure out what the problem was is actually a lot easier than I thought it would be. In fact, I located the manual that came with the RV, and turns out they have a pretty good step-by-step process for testing the step out and figuring out what's wrong. Testing the motor, testing the four-way connector and the override switches and all that stuff. And I'll go ahead and drop a link down below if you want to download this if you don't have one for your particular step. But yeah, super helpful. Now the thing is, when I connected everything back up after a couple of years of not using it, it seemed like everything was working properly, and I figured, geez, maybe it's just okay now. But after just testing it and going through some of these procedures and just kind of opening and closing it repeatedly, it eventually stopped working, and I'm like, okay, that's why it was intermittent before. So I even tried, you know, tapping on it with a wrench on the windings on, you know, where the motor is, and actually it started working again. Well, I decided not to leave it to chance, and I went ahead and ordered another replacement motor from Amazon, and here it is right here. It was about 70 bucks for this particular one, and looks like it's pretty easy to replace. And I'll also put a link to all the other components for this particular step in the description for you guys in case you need to look that up. In order to replace the motor, you're going to have to make sure that your step is in the extended position, and so if it's stuck and it won't come out, you're going to have to first probably remove the linkage on that arm connected to the gear assembly, so that you could manually pull the step out and be able to get to the motor assembly. Before removing the motor, I want to make sure that there's no power to the step, so I want to disconnect that main 4-wire connector that's coming from the RV. Then I want to disconnect the power going to the motor itself, and there's just this plug on the side, so you want to remove that as well. Now all that's left to do is to remove the 3 bolts holding the motor down to the gear assembly, and I'm going to do that using a 10mm socket. Now when you're releasing that last bolt, make sure you're holding on to that motor because it may just drop down. So you want to just take your time removing that last one, and the motor itself should just kind of release. If it doesn't, it might be a little stuck. Just wiggle it a little bit, and it should just come out. Now there's also probably going to be a gear attached to the other end of it that goes inside the gearbox. So just be aware of that when you drop that down, is to bring it down just kind of directly and don't twist it, because that gear is going to be sitting on the other end. Now at that point you can just remove the washers and that little gear from the old motor and transfer it over to the new one. And I went ahead and cleaned all the grease off of that gear and replaced it with some new grease. I just used some white lithium grease that I had on hand, and just gave it a fresh little coat of grease before I'm going to go ahead and reassemble this. You can just lift the motor back into the gear assembly and bolt it back down. Then reconnect the electrical connection to the motor. and you want to kind of stay out of the way before you connect the main power on that 4-way plug, because once it's powered up, the step may actually close. Now once you're out of the way, you can reconnect the power and reconnect that 4-way connector, and the step should probably come back to life. Now I went ahead and just put a zip tie and tidied up the cables there so that it wasn't just hanging free, and everything seemed to be working just fine after everything was put back together. We sure had some good times, didn't we? Oh man, it's a beautiful night. The fire's getting low.